There we go. So thank you all very much for joining us today. I am really excited to be able to offer this webinar. I've been looking forward to it, frankly, for months, if not years, as I've watched the partnership members work on this really important issue, because I have said, and I do believe, that racial impact notes are some of the most important things we can do to help undo institutional racism in this country and help our children get a good start in life. We all know that our country faces structural racism and that it is built in to almost any policy area you can think of across a wide slate of issues. There are a lot of people doing really wonderful work in our country fighting individual topics, individual aspects of racism and individual issues. But if we want to stop, if we want to undo the structural racism we have and prevent more racism from being built into the structure, then we need a process that intervenes at the very start of policy making to make sure that we understand the racial implications of any bill that is passed. This is a solution that is a structural solution to structural problems. It's also a multi-issue solution that protects kids across a wide range of issues. As as a result, it's really been a natural fit for children's advocates that work on multi-issue issues affecting children. Um, and so there are a number of partnership members who have been working to get racial impact notes built into their state's procedures. Today, we're going to be sharing some of those with you and talking about what it takes to make those effective. And once you have them, what it means to actually make them work. Having said that, I'm going to now ask my colleague Caleb to share his screen, and I am going to turn this webinar over first to Tasha Green-Kuzat and to Mitch Lifson, who just successfully won a really broad and important piece of legislation in Illinois um, requiring racial impact notes. And they're going to talk to you both about that bill and about a companion bill that creates the background that they need in order to make the racial impact note effective and powerful. So this is our run of show today. We're going to hear first from Tasha and Mitch. Then we're going to turn to Mariama and Rachel in Maryland. We had hoped to have Kim Perry talk after that, but unfortunately she has a family medical crisis, so I will speak extremely briefly about that, but she will be sharing resources in the email that we send out with the recording after the webinar. And then I will talk really briefly about some of the racial equity impact note work in other states, and then we'll take questions and answers. So we'll now turn this over to Tasha and Mitch.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tasha Green-Cruzat. I am a senior fellow at the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at the University of California School of Law in Irvine, and also the Institute for Global Child Advocacy. I was formerly the executive director of a wonderful organization called Voices for Illinois Children. Voices is in transition, and we are excited about the new collaboration emerging with the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy. And I have with me today Mitch Lifson from Voices for Illinois Children, who was actually partnered with me to get this effort passed. And so we are delighted to be with all of you today. Our effort at securing a racial Impact Note Act took place over several years, and you can advance to the next slide. But before we begin with that, we want to just do a review of that journey with you. So let's first take a quick look at what a racial impact note or statement is and its purpose. The statements or notes are really a legislative mechanism to see if an introduced piece of legislation will either create racial and ethnic disparities, make existing disparities worse, or hopefully eliminate them. There are states that have enacted a requirement for such statements on criminal justice bills and state grant applications, but in principle, they can be used to take to take a look at a bill or bills impacting affordable housing provisions, college tuition, or high school graduation requirements. While differences exist in structure and application, Illinois, Connecticut, Maine now have broad-based racial impact notes or statement acts that cover multiple subject areas as opposed to just being confined to one subject area, such as criminal justice. But it's not just a perspective view. The requirement puts in place a mechanism for examining existing disparities and bringing to the public arena the question of what barriers or discriminatory policies cause these disparities. That should at least cause some legislators to say, if this bill doesn't address those disparities, then what else do we need to do? Next slide. Illinois did have prior pieces of legislation designed to look at racial and ethnic disparities. For example, just to name two, there was an approved bill requiring the Department of Public Health to look at health disparities, and another bill designed to look at racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal justice arena. When it came to individuals partaking in a diversion from prosecution programs, in fact, the second bill actually began as a piece of legislation to create a criminal sentencing impact note. In that vein, we were looking for a legislative mechanism to require the analysis of racial and ethnic disparities and the impact of those proposed legislation. Next slide. So in 2017, a senator at our request filed a bill to create a state racial impact note act. Just for background, our Constitution, the Illinois Constitution, requires that any piece of legislation have 3 separate readings in each chamber. So we patterned some of the procedural language of the bill on prior legislation enacting existing note acts in the state. So under the language in the bill, before the second reading of the bill in the bill's chamber of origin, a member can request a racial impact note act. The language does indicate which agency or board is responsible for certain requests concerning education, criminal justice, or local government, but with broader language directing the request to the agency, the board, or the commission that would be responsible for actually implementing the bill. If the agency cannot make a determination, then it needs to state so publicly. Well, the Senate Assignments Committee, which is where the Senate initially assigns all introduced legislation, never let the bill out for a hearing. Next slide. So the next year, a version of the bill passed the House, but was not taken up by the Senate. Then the following year, a version of the bill passed the Senate, but that was not taken up by the House. Continuing our question, Representative Camille Lilly, filed the bill in the House, but it was languished in the House Rules Committee, and it was not released to another committee hearing. So just some stalling going on here. Next slide. But during that time, what were the arguments we made for the legislation, which is important, and what did other opponents say about that, about the racial impact of legislation? Well, Voices is also a partner with the Annie E. Casey Foundation Kids Count program. As such, on a regular basis, we are looking at disaggregated data on the well-being of Illinois children with respect to poverty, health, education, and other data points on family and community. Having that data helped us make the arguments on existing disparities. So, for example, in 2019, 9% of Illinois white children were in poverty compared to 34% of African American children. So it is an alarming statistic that Illinois legislators need to see on a regular basis and consider when passing legislation. So along those lines, legislators should be asking if existing state services designed to address disparities are in fact doing so. Is the state being efficient in spending its dollars in the areas where they are needed? Well, Opponents argue that there isn't enough data to produce racial impact notes on a regular basis. In some cases, agencies are not collecting the demographic data. Plus, there are already 8 different note acts in the Illinois statute. Isn't one more going to slow the legislative process down even further, is what they were asking. What if someone has introduced legislation in an effort to do the right thing, but the other side of the aisle wants to use the Note Act just to slow up the bill? Next slide. But we are here today talking to you about our success in passing the measures. So obviously something fantastic happened. What was it? Well, George Floyd's unfortunate death, the pandemic, and the controversy surrounding the then Illinois House Speaker, and eventually an election of a new speaker may have all played a critical role. Momentum grew for legislative reforms to combat racism and invest in under-resourced communities. Led by the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, General Assembly members began holding hearings on potential reforms in the areas of economic, criminal justice, education, and health. The hearings further spotlighted inequities and fostered additional conversations on how to actually address them. Next slide. We had already approached the then chair of the Black Caucus about a measure to expand the state's collection of racial and ethnic data relative to those assessing state services. It wasn't just because of the Racial Impact Note Act. Repeatedly in our Kids Count work, state agencies would tell us they just didn't collect demographic data for many of the programs they ran. As noted with the efficiency argument above, we found it difficult to determine if Illinois was actually working to address the inequities facing Illinois children and their needs. Several years ago, the state approved a measure that the Illinois Department of Human Services collect such data. So we work with the caucus and the administration on expanding that requirement to other state agencies, and also mandated that the entities cover the act regularly report the data, and if there is a delay, report on the progress of collecting such data. That, to a certain degree, removed the argument that the data would not be available to produce a racial impact note. This provision was contained in the caucus's bill containing education reforms. The legislator approved that bill in this year, in January of this year. The language on creating a state racial impact note act was contained in the health reform package. We actually got some resistance from some community organizations that insisted instead wanted a commission to address racism. Voices supported the commission's concept, but also argued that it's not the same as when a bill is on the floor and the bill is actually moving. While on our overall goal is to eliminate inequities, we can't be stepping backwards with legislation worsening circumstances. Plus, a commission is not part of that legislative process. The legislator approved the health reform package in March, and here we are today to tell you that in Illinois statute, now effective, there is a state racial impact note act. Next slide. We hope it will be an effective tool to combat racism and remove barriers, but just having it on the books is a victory. As was once said on a television series, but probably used elsewhere, the first step in solving any problem is recognizing that there is one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasha and Mitch. So as we think about racial impact statements and preserving children, families, and communities, next slide, you will also, we also recognize that yes, ACY is a Kids Count partner as well. And we know that structural racism is pervasive throughout the everyday lives of Maryland's children. And we see it as underfunding of schools in Black and Latino communities and underfunding education, programs. We also see it in terms of overrepresentation of Black and Latino youth in the youth justice system. And we also see it as it relates to low reunification of Black children in the foster care system. And so with that, we recognize that institutional racism, which definitely is that racial inequity, the unfair policies and practices, discriminatory treatment, limit of access, does exist. And we also recognize then that also spells out in terms of the structural racism and how that is then embedded within the structures that we all have come to know that service children and youth. And so next slide, we are going to talk a little bit about our journey within Advocates for Children and Youth and the partnerships and the collaboration that we had with legislators, as well as our nonprofit partners, to really begin to dismantle some of these pillars of structural racism. And so I'm honored to also share this time with my colleague and our team member, Rachel White, who has just been absolutely integral as our child welfare director on this journey. Rachel?
Thank you, Mariama. So as was stated earlier, I think it was you, Deborah, who stated that racial impact notes, because they're at the beginning, they can help sort of intervene before more racism can occur, more structural racism can occur. It's a mitigating factor, one of the mitigating factors to addressing and possibly reducing disparities. And that's something that, at Advocates for Children and Youth, we are very passionate about. And so taking on race impact statements as a policy priority was without hesitation, for sure. You can go to the next slide, please. So timeline, the journey towards equity. It wasn't to get the racial impact notes passed or even addressed in the Maryland General Assembly. It was not an easy task. It wasn't overnight. It took years and years of work and collaboration. And so I just wanted to share our journey with you on how we achieved a victory. So in the summer of 2018, through research of race impact statements, the effectiveness of racial impact statements, it was an issue that I became extremely passionate about. So in November of 2018, I approached a delegate in our General Assembly, Delegate Jazz Lewis, and he and I worked on previous pieces of legislation to address disparities, to include requiring the Department of Human Services to collect disaggregated data, as well as the Maryland State Department of Education. So we already had similar interests with respect to reducing disparities. So I felt like he would be the perfect champion to share this information with. So I approached him in November 2018 with my ideas, and he was on board and indicated that he was interested as well. And so he coalesced other advocates so as we began our journey to getting this implemented. Certain advocates included Bowie State University, the University of Baltimore, the University of Maryland, and the Sentencing Project as well. And as the years progressed, we began to pull in more partners and more advocates who were also interested in the issue. So in Maryland, the process when it comes to creating any sort of note or analysis on a bill, that process is done through the Department of Legislative Services. So any fiscal note and any analysis is created by this group within the Maryland General Assembly. So in December of 2018, prior to our session, which is from January to April, we decided to have a meeting with the Department of Legislative Services to discuss our goals, because they would be the ones responsible for writing the notes. And so we wanted to give them a heads up and sort of gauge their energy to determine if they would be an ally or if they were a group that we would have to sort of press harder on the issue. So we met in December of 2018. In January, at the beginning of session, we provided the Department of Legislative Services with guidance from other states who were already addressing this issue and already had legislation in their respective assemblies. And so to show that this wouldn't be Maryland's first time, because sometimes Maryland, I'm not sure how it is in other states, doesn't necessarily want to be the first. And so we were, wanted them to know that other states were doing it and that it would be wise to get on board. So this is January 2019 for the 2019 session. If you could just go to the next slide, please. So during the 2019 session, the Department of Legislative Services was not on board at all. They indicated they did not have the capacity to write additional notes. And then if we opened the door to discuss the racial impact, what about advocates who wanted to discuss the environmental impact or just all different types of impacts? They didn't want to open the door by focusing on race, and they did not have the capacity, according to the Department of Legislative Services. And so the Department of Legislative Services reached out to the Senate president at that time and indicated they did not want, this bill to go through because of the workload, and it didn't. We didn't even have a hearing or anything. It never was assigned to a committee. So that was the 2019 session. In October 2019, advocates got back together and said, what can we do to expand the Department of Legislative Services capacity? And so the Lab of Applied Social Sciences and Research at the University of Maryland, they have already been doing research on disparities and inequities and actually have written racial impact statements for other entities and agreed that they would be willing to write the racial impact statements on every bill. So it would sort of be like an MOU between the Department of Legislative Services and the entity at the University of Maryland. And so we wrote that in the bill in preparation for the 2020 session. 2020 session, the bill still did not pass. It did not get a bill hearing at all. And this was attributed to the leadership at the time, the Senate president and the Speaker of the House, who were not progressive by any means and did not want in-house work that would be, primarily or, in the past geared towards the Department of Legislative Services. They didn't want to sort of have another outside entity writing the statements, even though the Department of Legislative Services did not have the capacity to do so. So another session goes by. So now we're in January 2021. And in the meantime, there's been, racial tensions are extremely high in America, the death of George Floyd. We've also received new leadership in the General Assembly, where our Speaker was of the House, Adrienne Jones, is the first African-American female speaker in Maryland's history. And also we had a more progressive Senate president as well. And so this happened in January 2021, and we approached as advocates both entities, the president and the Speaker of the House, to explain what we were trying to do for the upcoming session and how can we make sure that we are successful this year? Like, how can we become allies? And so you can go to the next slide. Speaker Adrienne Jones specifically, she said, we don't want this to be legislation because it won't go into effect the following year. Like, time is of the essence. We want to address the situation now. So she suggested, instead of legislation, that the Maryland General Assembly would adopt a pilot program to add racial impact statements to the analysis of new legislative proposals. And that's exactly what happened. And so the goal of the impact statements is to bring awareness and attention to existing structural racism within our systems and reverse its impacts through access to information for legislators to make informed decisions. The information also will be publicly available to the public before they hire drafting testimony or speaking orally at hearings. So Maryland's new program required legislators to evaluate how bills impacted communities of color before they were even voted on and before they could be signed into law. You can go to the next slide, please. And so the program focus isn't as broad as I would like. I want it to be, you know, for every state system, every policy, every bill that is introduced, that it has a racial impact statement. But because this is a pilot program and we want to honor the capacity of the Lab of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Maryland, the program is focused primarily on criminal justice bills, specifically criminal justice bills that establish a new misdemeanor or felony offense, or any criminal justice bill that creates a mandatory minimum or changes sentencing for existing crimes. And this affects both the criminal justice side and the youth justice side as well. You can go to the next slide. And this is just when you get the slide deck, this is a link to the news article and news interview that explains in more detail what we were able to accomplish. And with respect to next steps, the Senate President and the Speaker of the House have already agreed that if the program is deemed successful, because we have to do an analysis in the interim to determine if the racial impact statements impacted the legislation that they were attached to this year, that there's possibility to extend the use of racial impact statements to address other areas of disparities in other systems in Maryland. And so Maryland joins Connecticut, New Jersey, and Iowa as one of the only states to run a pilot program as opposed to the legislative route. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
You're
Next
welcome.
slide, please. So we had hoped to have a third speaker today, Kimberly Perry, who's the Executive Director of DC Action for Children. Unfortunately, last night we learned that a family member has a medical emergency and she can't join us. So she's going to put together, after the medical emergency is over, some resources that we will share with everyone who attended the webinar. What I want to highlight for you so that you know what to look for in her resources is that DC Act merged with another organization last year, and that organization did the work of actually passing their racial impact note legislation. And I think their legislation is broader, has some other racial equity aspects to it. What Kim was going to talk about is the work it takes to actually implement this and make it meaningful. And we'll share anything and everything that she's eager to share with you about that. But I think it's important to know that, you know, DC is one of the places where they're now trying to put racial impact note into effect and have them have real impact on what's happening. I also wanted to comment on both the Maryland and the Illinois bill and the concept in general, that there's two different aspects to think about this. One, of course, is that it informs the whole legislature about the racial impact of a bill. But the other is that it gives advocates who have a champion in the legislature a tool to elevate the racial impact of a bill. So even if the bill is not initially likely to pass, if there's somebody with the power in the legislature to get the racial impact note created, that's then gives the advocates a tool that they can use to further either work to get the bill passed or to defeat it, depending on the consequences. As I mentioned earlier, these are not the only 3 partnership members that have been working on racial impact notes. So let's take a look at the next slide. There are partnership members in other states that have been working on aspects of racial equity. All of these links are live, and so you'll get them all when you get the recording and the slides. One is in Rochester, New York, where they were able to win a charter amendment to require all the city budget departments to consider equity in building their budgets. The Maine Children's Alliance was not the lead on an effort to get racial impact statements, but they supported it. And we've given you their testimony and some other information about it. The Maine bill is also really important. It's not quite as expansive as the Illinois one, because in Maine, there's a more limited number of people who can actually require the racial impact note to be written, whereas in Illinois, I believe it's every legislator. Of course, also Illinois is larger, but it's still a really valuable and important one. And then in Nebraska, Voices for Children in Nebraska is supporting the introduction of a bill following a feasibility study, which was done by the legislature in partnership with a local university. And the bill that they're trying to move in Nebraska would require the Office of Legislative Research to prepare the racial impact statements for bills. And I think that's it. Caleb, show me the next slide and then we can start taking questions. Oh, yeah. I did just want to mention, aligned with this whole theme of interest in race equity, the partnership will be offering a webinar on June 30th at 2 p.m. with the National Black Children Development Institute on their issues, both nationally and at the state level, to support Black kids. So I encourage partnership members and other partners to watch for the registration for that. We have at least 3 questions, so I'm really eager to share those with you and get some answers from our speakers. Caleb, you might want to stop sharing your slides so that people can see our speakers. And the first question, I think, was actually to Tasha, but I open it to all of our members. If you could just say again what other states are using racial impact statements. And of course, Mariama and Rachel listed some of those in their slides, but if there are others you wanted to mention as well. Tasha or Mitch? Yeah.
Sure. Mitch, do you want to go ahead and take that?
Sure.
Talk about it.
So prior to the most recent action, in some fashion, but again, there were limitations on the subject areas. Iowa, Colorado, Oregon, New Jersey, and Florida all had some version of a racial impact statement or note act.
Great. The next question is, I think, really for Mariama and Rachel. How will the Maryland legislature determine if the pilot program is considered successful? Is there a clear measure of success for that? And I will add my own question, which is there a timeline on that?
Right, the timeline is to determine that before January, when our next session begins. We are in the process of collaborating to schedule a meeting to determine how will we know if this works or not. There currently is not a measure available that I'm aware of that the General Assembly plans to use, but we were just told that if it's successful, we will expand it. So I don't know if they're going to look at the bills that had the racial impact statements attached to them and see if they were passed or not passed based on the disparities that existed based on the note.
Great. And Mariama, do you want to just add? I see you put a note in there.
Yeah, I just put a note that certainly you all can go to the link outlining the news article, but if you also want to actually see the details of the bill, it's Maryland House Bill 1016.
Great. And Caleb, please, let's make sure we include a link to that in the resources. So those are some of the very concrete questions. And we also have 3 really interesting questions about the broader aspects of this. And so I'm going to start with a question from Dr. Patricia Jones-Blessman, who I believe is also in Illinois, and ask the panelists, given the current political climate and the increased awareness of systemic inequities, who is harnessing the power of this moment to fund, organize, and execute getting the racial impact note passed in other states? I'm going to ask our panelists to comment, but I would also encourage any of the funders who are participating, if you want to put a comment in the chat, we would be delighted to hear from funders that have joined the call on this as well. But let me start with Tasha and Mariama and Rachel and Mitch.
Sure. As far as I know, I don't know of any funder that is specifically funding efforts to pass a racial impact note. But I definitely think that there is appetite, and there is certainly, I would say opportunities in terms of grant opportunities around racial justice. But I think that it's important to really look at what has happened over the last couple of years with the passage of whether it's limited, restricted, pilot, or a broad base racial impact note, to look at the importance and the significance of what that actually really means. And so hopefully we can get funders that will support this measure. It's a very important measure. And, for Illinois, for us, it was definitely, as we did our work over the last, probably 4 years to get this passed, we were just a very, very small staff, and having that support out there to be able to champion that, a funder backing us up would have been great. I wouldn't necessarily say they would have made it faster, but I think that definitely messaging and getting that out. We had to do a lot of that, a lot of conversations, messaging, education with the small staff. And so having that additional support to be able to do that marketing work or that education would be a tremendous help.
I mean, certainly as we think about systematic and systemic racism, and then how that breaks down into institutional racism as well as structural racism, and the cycle that we see between all three, it is going to be absolutely critical to have funding in this area, such that teams, we're also a very small team, literally Rachel by herself, often with an intern or what have you, and just really other advocates and on the coalitions, really moving this forward. And so I think that it is absolutely critical to be able to have the funding to really begin to address the systemic issues that then show up in terms of institutional and structural racism. And then also I see in the chat, there's a question about, what do you think about governors and mayors requiring racial impact statements for their own proposals or initiatives? And, certainly for legislatures that are not necessarily willing to quote unquote take this on, I do think that leadership, wherever we can find leadership that is willing to take this on and take that step, that hopefully we can then see how other legislators will gain additional awareness. For some, it may be comfort. For others, it may be legitimizing it. I'm not sure what, but I do think that we need to see leadership begin to, both mayors, governors, et cetera, taking this next step.
I think that's a good segue to this topic. I am curious about what our other panelists think about governors or mayors requiring racial impact statements for their own proposals or initiatives. And I particularly would appreciate your thoughts both about what that means for the advocates working with them and their capacity. Both of you in very different ways really focused on making sure that the racial impact statements had quality and capacity and were going to really be meaningful. So I wonder if you would want to comment on what that means for governors and mayors on working on that.
Well, I'll just say on the local level, there are jurisdictions that have them. And we started on our quest. Seattle had such a requirement in place. King County, Washington. I know the Minneapolis School Board has used it in a lot of its planning. In some ways, for advocates, there are actually more opportunities because on the local level, you're usually dealing more with zoning and development, as well as resources for school districts. So I would say there are a lot of opportunities to use it on the local level.
Anyone else want to comment on that one?
No, I was just gonna say I definitely agree with that. And as you mentioned Seattle, we have a county here in Maryland, Montgomery County, who also uses race impact statements and analysis before introducing policies like on the city council level. It's extremely important.
Great. We have 3 more questions that are kind of related. They're all about using racial impact note legislation in more conservative states. And Mandy Abeldinger says, you know, how do you do this where anything with the term racial equity attached is a non-starter, and where there are even laws being passed intentionally limiting conversation and teaching about structural racism? She has 2 questions. One is their concern that depending on how the legislation is written, those who feel that white working class people are losing power might use the racial impact note to argue that the legislation disproportionately impacts white people. And the related question is that actually a way to get this passed in red states, to write the language in a way that both sides feel like they could use and benefit from the racial impact notes? And then we have an anonymous attendee who asked a related question about how you see this movement in relationship to legislatures looking at proposals to limit critical race theory in education systems and to push back against systemic racism being a myth and not real. And I think there's one more, and yeah, has anyone done this in a Republican controlled legislature? I would like to know how. So I'm going to put all of those out there, and I'm also going to offer, but not require, one of the partnership members who is on this call as a attendee. I've unmuted you, Aubrey. If you want to weigh in on this, feel free, but please do not feel you have to. We do have, as you may have noticed, a member working on this in Nebraska, which is, you know, pretty much as red a state as you're going to find. And if Aubrey is willing to be put on the spot, she may be able to offer comments on that as well. But I'll give her a couple of minutes to get her thoughts together and turn this over first to our panelists and see what they have to say about it.
So, you know, Mitch and I, you know, we work as a team, and there are some areas in Illinois where it is red, especially in downstate Illinois. And it was important for me as a woman of color, right, to make sure that all of the efforts that we were making to get this passed, that we pull every lever that we could. And so oftentimes as a person of color, everyone's looking at us to say something, right? And it's always under the impression of we're representing our own people. And you know, Mitch and I, you know, Mitch is a white man, obviously you can see that. But having him help make that case and to talk about those questions, you know, it's interesting when you have a face that looks different from mine, talking about these issues and talking about the importance and being able to feel those types of questions. And Mitch was asked just those types of questions. So I do want to give him an opportunity to respond and talk about you know, his strategy and how he handled those questions. Mitch.
Having the facts at hand, I would say, is most important. So I could be talking to a legislator from a very conservative district, but I might have the data from his or her county showing how stark the disparities were. And then to indicate to that legislator, who probably would know this anyhow, we're all paying for any remedial education, any other social issues that result from the inequities. So why don't we work to address them? And in the end, we actually not only will better people's lives, you may save more money for the state. So, which is not to say that there don't still need to be resources poured into different programs. So I would just reiterate that when you have the facts in hand and you can put it right in front of the legislator, particularly about his or her district, that helps.
I agree with that. Maryland is a Republican state as well. And it took our General Assembly leadership to switch Democratic and before we had any success. And so, but when it comes to like speaking about race equity with those who may not understand or think it's taking something away from someone by, investing in equity and achieving equity. It is all about framing. And I had to use the cost benefit analysis as well, Mitch, like the cost of homelessness, the cost of incarceration based on the inequities, and using the data from the counties as well, that this is what's happening in your state. And also like continuing to hone in, like giving more to those who need it. It does not mean we're taking away from you. Like that seems to be a narrative that some people have, and just trying to clearly lay out how that is untrue. Providing targeted interventions does not take away from anyone at all. And trying to show how equity or investing in certain populations actually uplifts entire communities as well. And then and with respect to how the racial impact notes are written in Maryland, like it explains like, the impact on minorities, but it also does explain the impact on white communities as well. So that may be something worth considering.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because there is a lot of research out there, and even a lot of even contemporary books. I don't know how many of you have read The Sum of Us, The Cost of Racism and How We Can Prosper Together. There's another book I think that recently has come out as well, talking about the economics of and the impact of racism, and the fact that it economically impacts whites greater than it had at some greater levels as well. And so we definitely need to begin to change that narrative. And that's where I think, Tasha, you talked about how you and Mitch and Rachel, I know you as well on that journey with others, with the University of Maryland, and just getting in and diving deep into the data. And that's why also the Kids Count data and being a Kids Count partner is just so critical for us as well, because being able to have the access to the data and being able to have the funding to just do the data analysis and partner with others to look at more closely at the data, and to really see what the story is that the data reveals and the facts connected to it is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and Mara, I'm so glad you lifted up the Kids Count and the EKC Foundation, because the work that we did in terms of the advocacy and the education, having that data, legislators counted on that annual Kids Count. They were, glad to see it, happy to see it. And so it was definitely a critical tool that we use to talk about, not just the disparities, but to talk about all children. And it was so helpful, so having that heft behind us with the Kids Count. So if you are a Kids Count grantee, and you do produce those reports, use them to your advantage.
So Aubrey, I did unmute you, and if you want to weigh in on this, since you're trying to move this in Nebraska, I invite you to do that now.
Yeah, well, obviously we haven't been successful yet. So, I think we're still trying to figure out the path forward, but I think the points raised about thinking through messengers and messaging are really smart. And definitely something we have to do more of here in Nebraska is get some additional messengers who can carry some of these messages for us. Another thing, the only thing I would add to that is something we've also been thinking about is whether or not we could potentially do this on a small scale without the legislature. And we tried to get some efforts going this year that weren't successful, but may revisit that idea going forward of just partnering kind of outside of the legislature with the university to have those analysis produced, and then sharing them at the legislature, sharing them publicly as part of the conversation. So I think, that's potentially another option to think through is, and another area where funding may be helpful as well, is could you just do that without a formal legislative policy to do so?
Great. We have two other really interesting questions, and I do encourage others as well to pop your questions in the chat or the Q&A. One question is from Courtney Moore. What are the best ways to raise awareness about racial equity, specifically via racial impact notes, among populations that are served by racial impact note legislation? And I open this again to all our panelists. Do any of you want to take this one on? I'm not seeing, is this
Can you repeat it one more time? I'm sorry.
Sure. What are the best ways to raise awareness about racial impact, about racial equity, specifically using racial impact notes among populations that are served by racial impact note legislation? In other words, I think, can you build on these racial impact notes to help build an understanding and awareness of, I would say, institutionalized racism and structuralized racism?
Yeah, I certainly think that you can. I think what's important for those of us who have passed a racial impact note, racial impact note legislation in our state is that we continue to share how that's like, how is that working for you? How is that doing? And for advocates to be able to report that information, I think that it's very important. When Mitch and I, one of the things that we couldn't find when we were sort of doing some research is finding just some real examples. And part of that is because, maybe we needed to look in some of the right places in terms of how folks are making that information available. So making that information available, because we know that it's a great tool to have, I think would be extremely helpful. And so Mitch and I and team plan on, of course, first of all, making sure that each and every time we need to pull that lever is pulled, and that we keep that on the radar to say that we have this racial impact note that can be used to sort of, bring about that dialogue and that discourse of what we need to have before that bill is passed. So it's like having that conversation. And so part of the work for us, now that we have the racial impact note, is to make sure that we foster those conversations so that others can learn and we can continue to have this dialogue and make some significant changes. I don't know if that answered the question, but hopefully it gets at what you're looking for.
And this also allows us to recognize that racial impact notes serve all racial populations. And so, although we tend to highlight the disparities, which are absolutely critical, I also want to just make sure that when we're talking about racial impact notes, we're not just talking about certain populations, because it does allow for an opportunity to really further illuminate the disparities and inequities that might exist within certain populations. It can also further illuminate socioeconomic trends and how that impacts various racial demographics as well. So really seeing that it can help to further illuminate and highlight the disparities and inequities within populations and also within and across populations.
And they also can be used for different audiences. So for where you're thinking about legislators, but you can use that same note to change systems. So if it says like a certain percentage of whatever it says and whatever system that affects, you can use that data, like repurpose the data to make change in different levels of government and different agencies as well.
Great. We have some more really thoughtful questions, so I'm going to move us on. One is, how are you thinking about related work that is starting to emerge using youth impact statements with an emphasis on racial equity? Some communities are working to achieve a similar goal by using youth impact assessments, like those used in many other countries that put an emphasis on racial equity. And she points out that it seems like an opportunity to join forces. Do any of our panelists want to comment on that?
I'll just start out by saying that part of what helped in getting the data collection language included in the reform package put forward by the Black Caucus was there is a lot of discussion in Illinois on how to recraft the early childhood education and care system in our state, and race equity is playing a big part in that. So there's been a lot of discussion about knowing what the data is as a point in time, but also having enough data to do a longitudinal review over time to see what the impact is. So it definitely is working with it, and was definitely a factor in all of this.
Yes, and certainly we know here in Maryland, we are several steps behind in terms of our efforts around youth and juvenile justice. And so we are also can envision how these statements and this process and the overall process and approach could hopefully help us in the next legislative session and in coming legislative sessions to make some further progress. We did make a little bit of progress this session, but we have a ways to go. And so I do agree that yes, this process could help us in that regard.
So I'm going to take us on to a question from Cassandra McKee. Love this conversation. Thank you for bringing your hearts and minds to this topic. Organizing groups are experimenting with deep canvassing to move white people to a neutral or more supportive position on racial justice issues. How can we apply the personal connection and storytelling aspect of deep canvassing to work with legislators? Do any of you want to comment on that?
Well, and I may be off here a little bit. However, I also, when I think about deep canvassing, I also think about several states that have been engaged in conversations around, truth and reconciliation. We know that in the city of Dallas, right, which we also know is a fairly conservative state, they have several initiatives around truth and reconciliation that are occurring. There are colleges and universities that are also establishing truth and reconciliation centers. And so perhaps partnering that concept around creating dialogue opportunities for communities to come together and including legislators and including delegates and including those are within the political realm in the community conversations to be able to help move the conversation is one thought.
So I want to point out that we do have a comment in the chat, which has a link for more about child impact statements. We will include that in our resources. And we do have a final comment question, and this will have to be our last one because we're running out of time. Racial impact notes seem like an amazing opportunity to limit future legislation from harming communities of color, but are you also looking into efforts to address existing state level policies that contribute to harming certain communities? And which our questioner didn't add, but I will, is there a way to put racial impact notes to work to help with that?
In Maryland, we're definitely working to address existing disparities that are being perpetuated through existing policies. We had a successful data win this past legislative session, which requires the Department of Human Services and Maryland State Department of Education to provide disaggregated data on certain indicators. And then with that information, we plan to create recommendations to reduce the existing disparities that exist based on the data that is present. And I agree that we can use the race impact notes on our journey, as well as the data that I'm sure they're using is from the current and from the past, of existing, that highlights what the existing disparities are. But yes, I definitely believe we have to work on the existing disparity, the existing issues, as well as preventing them from occurring in the future.
Yeah, and I think that this conversation, just in regards to racial impact notes and sort of where we're moving towards as a country, and really lifting this up gives us that opportunity to continue to look back at other pieces of legislation that might be harmful and to get the support around that. So I think just the conversation along, the discussion, the movement I think, it gives us all an opportunity to sort of take a step back and say, okay, what else, as we are, and I hate to say bracing ourselves, but, racism is systemic here. So we do have to brace ourselves for the next thing that comes, upon us to sort of, tackle it. But it does give us that opportunity to have those conversations, have more of that, and bring it and really sort of lift it up.
Great. Well, we are at our time limit and a little bit over. I want to really thank all of our panelists, and also many of the people in the audience. I think this has been a wonderful set of questions and a really rich discussion about this work. I am so thrilled we were able to bring this all to you, because I do believe this is one of the most important things that we can do to really start to undo institutional racism, structural racism in our country today. I will make sure that everyone gets the recording, the slides, the resources. And I welcome partnership members reaching out to other partnership members and to us to try and keep this conversation going. If there are funders on this call who want to learn more, please do reach out to me. I would love to see more partnership members being able to undertake this work in their states. I think, as I said at the start, we need structural solutions to a structural problem, and this is very much a structural solution. Have a wonderful day. Thank you all. I'm going to end the recording now.